All right, thank you very much for being. As I said, we're going to hear from Anne first, and then we'll move into the questions.
So, good evening. It's very nice to be here. It's my first time in Abu Dhabi for having me, and I'm speaking on female roles in ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and 21st century terrorism. Is this the right one? Yeah. So just a little bit about me. I spent about 10 years traveling the world. I went in West Bank, in Gaza, in Morocco, in Casablanca, where the suicide bombers came from, Lebanon, and talked to Hezbollah, Iraq. I helped design the detainee rehabilitation program for 20,000 detainees, 800 juveniles. And I lived in Belgium and traveled through Belgium, the Netherlands, France, and some of the other countries, UK. And I spoke to extremists and terrorists. So in all, over 400 of them. And I learned a lot speaking to them. These were field interviews. Sometimes in the West Bank, it was impossible to cross checkpoints. So I was invited, do you want to continue your research or do you want to go back because the checkpoint will close? And I said I'd like to continue my research. And they said, well, in that instance, this family who has spawned a terrorist asks you if you would like to stay as their guest tonight. So I even stayed in terrorist homes and enjoyed very good hospitality, by the way. So, and the groups that I interviewed ranged from PFLP, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad. We also worked in Chechnya with the Chechen Jihadis. We did psychological autopsies of, there were 120 suicide bombers. We did psychological autopsies of 65 of them. Let's see. And our research questions during that time of research was, what puts an individual on the terrorist trajectory? What might have prevented that? I'm a psychologist, so I wanted to know, if I got to you before the terrorist group did, could I prevent you from joining? Or, if you were already on the terrorist trajectory, could I take you off of it? And I had that opportunity. I worked in London with the Home Office, so I worked with them on Prevent and helped them design their Prevent strategy. And I had the opportunity, like I told you, in Iraq with the 20,000 detainees, and that was to take them back off the terrorist trajectory. I've also worked in Jordan, as I told our Jordanian colleague earlier, and I've worked in other countries advising them on de-radicalization and disengagement. And I've consulted to lots of governments, lots of places. And basically, my theory is terrorists are made, not born. This is a little girl in a safe house in Nablus. I went there after we arrived in Tel Aviv to go over to the West Bank and Gaza, at least for me. I flew into Ben Gurion, had a lot of hassles there, got searched going in, got searched going out. I was considered a suspect person because I did spend so much time in West Bank and Gaza. But one time I went, the day that I arrived, there were 2 suicide bombers that exploded themselves near Tel Aviv. We got over to near to Nablus, and oh, has it gone dead again? Sorry about that. And she's such a lovely little girl. We went to Nablus and the little village of Bet Farik, and we saw how the Israelis had already gone to their house and destroyed their house. And one of the little girls that you'll see in a later slide sat on my lap and told me, I didn't have time. I could only get my school books, and we ran out of here. Everything was destroyed in the house. And it was a 3-generation house. So you can imagine. But anyway, this little girl thought that I was from the Mossad, that I was Israeli, and had come to hassle the mother that ran the safe house. In fact, I was there to learn, to find out, you know, why would somebody help another young man to go and explode himself? And her response at that age, I think she's only 4, was to go and get a gun. She pointed it at me. It was a fake gun, play gun, but you know, it shows her response at a young age. And the person that was translating ran over to her and said, "You're not holding your gun correctly. Hold it like this." So, you know, think about it. If that's your upbringing, you're learning things that maybe it's so sad for you to learn at that age. Also, we have to remember that there's a lethal cocktail of terrorism, and from these 400 interviews, I learned that there's 4 things that are always there. There's a group that, by its nature, is political, has a political agenda, and it's willing to use terrorism. There's an ideology. It's always wrong, because it's never right. No matter what your cause is, it's never right to intentionally attack civilians. But the ideology argues that it is right. And these days we see ideologies that are using religion to make those arguments. Then third, there's some level of social support, and it can be all over your community, or it can be in small little pockets of community. Like, for instance, the Chechens, they said if they wanted to join a terrorist group, they went up to the mountains. They knew where to find the people. They knew where to get social support. They had already bought onto the ideology. And then there's a person that's hurting. There's something hurting inside of him. And what I found is what's hurting breaks out very differently if you're in a conflict zone or a non-conflict zone. So if you're living in the West Bank, if you're living in Gaza, if you're living in Chechnya, if you're living in Kashmir, the side controlled by India, you're in an active conflict zone. And you're seeing things, Afghanistan, you might have generations of conflict, and you've got a lot of trauma. So it's driven by PTSD, trauma and revenge. There's a group that says, I can help you fight this. I can help you fight the injustices. If you're in a non-conflict zone, it has a lot more to do with identity, discrimination, belonging, adventure, impressing the women. And it may also have to do with trauma, because the groups are really good at bringing video from other places, bringing video right now from Iraq and saying, look what the US is doing, look what the drones are doing. They killed this little kid, they burned him up. And you need to join us and help us. We can make you a man. We can help you impress the girls. We can give you an adventure. So, anyway, tonight we're looking at women and terrorism. And you probably know, terrorism is a male-dominated field. Of all the terrorist groups, the highest level of women that's ever represented in them is about 30%. And it varies from 0 to 30%. The men are generally in charge, even when the women are in, like in the Chechen group. We saw of the suicide bombers, the first suicide bombers were 2 young women. And pretty much they kept pace. It was 50% men, 50% women. But if you looked at the leaders, 100% men. Also, in some groups, women aren't even allowed to engage. They're, sorry, we don't need you. This is a man's battle. And sometimes the women do manage to break in, but they may be precluded from combat roles. All depends on what group you're in. In the FARC, obviously they were allowed to have combat roles. In Al-Qaeda, they were told, no, your role is to stay home and raise the next generation. Raise your sons to be fighters. And one of the things that we have to remember is we have a societal myth about women. All of us had mothers, I hope. I mean, you were born to a woman. And probably you were nursed at her breast and she was kind with you, I hope. And we like to believe that image of women because it's what we all needed, what we all wanted in our lives. And we don't like to believe that women can be violent. But the truth is that women can be violent just like men. And they're usually not as powerful as men. So, you know, if you go home and your wife slugs you, she's not going to do as much damage to you as vice versa if you hit her. But women are violent, and this talk on women terrorists will prove that to you. We don't want to believe that women kill, but here's a Palestinian woman that even posed with her children. And we now see women in ISIS doing the same thing, even taking their children off to Syria and Iraq to raise them in the so-called Islamic State. What are the roles for women in a terrorist group? They can be a hijacker, a trainer, an assassin, a bomb maker, a seducer, a saboteur, and a wife. Let's look at a few of these. Layla Khalid, she was from the PFLP, and she is credited with hiding grenades in her bra, you know, a place that hardly anybody will search. And before we had many hijackings, the PFLP perfected hijackings and raised a lot of money by doing it. She posed with a man. Can you do this again? She posed with a man and pretended that they were traveling as man and wife. And she's an attractive woman. Nobody questioned it. But she did get caught. This one is Amna Muna. She seduced a young man over to the West Bank. She texted with him and said, be sure to bring contraceptives. She gave the idea that she was going to have sex with him. In fact, she was luring him over to be caught by her group and killed. And when she was later caught and put in prison, I met her in prison outside of Tel Aviv, and had a chance to talk with her. She was a quite evil woman. She controlled the other prisoners, and one prisoner, another woman, stood up to her, and she arranged for that woman to have oil thrown in her face, hot oil. So you see what kind of woman she is. They can be a trainer martyr. This woman was in Gaza, and she was claiming that she was training a group of women to be suicide bombers. And we've seen women in the training role many times. Oops, did I go backwards? Sorry. Here's an assassin. She's a member of the IRA. She planted bombs, and she was, for a time, known as the most lethal woman in Europe. I think she's been supplanted by now. Oh, sorry, still going backwards. So there's also other roles for women: internet instigator, ideologue, translator. So we have to remember, as Mubin was telling you earlier, sometimes if you're in a conservative society, the women are expected to stay home. They can't run around the same as the others. Even in Belgium, I would find that the men would tell me that they were dating European women, they were going to the nightclubs when they could get in, but their women stayed home. And where better to find adventure if you're stuck in your home than on the internet? And then you can be somebody that's downloading Islamic materials that are promoting jihad and translating them into your own language. We found this in the Netherlands. You can be a singer-songwriter, and let's look at a few of these. So instigator assassin, we had Colleen LaRose. She was known as Jihad Jane in the US, and she went out to, she was going to kill one of these people that had made pictures of the Prophet. And she was radicalized online, but it was through a love affair. And she had a very horrible childhood. She had been raped since she was 13 by her own father. And she was very easily led down the line, and the guy that seduced her told her to come over to Ireland. He, in fact, had seduced other women and didn't tell her that he was involved with other women, and he talked her into taking out an assassination attempt on this artist. Thankfully, she was not successful. She was arrested, and she's in prison now, and she realizes how she was tricked. We also have a wife operative. This is Jihad Jane's friend, Jamie. Jamie was also seduced by the same guy, not for the same mission, but he wanted her to come and be his wife. So he was a terrorist operating out of Ireland and seducing her. Here we have a woman from the UK that was glorifying militant jihad. She was writing things like, it's about beheading, it's not messy or as hard as you think, it's all about the turn of the wrist. You feel the knife, you hit the wind in the food pipe, but don't stop. Contribute with all your might. And you see some of her other poetry. So she was somebody that was glorifying these ideas and saying it's a good idea and you should go and do it. She worked, by the way, in Heathrow Airport, and she wrote on a receipt that she wanted to carry out an attack. She was also arrested. We have instigator wife. Malika Arud, she was a Belgian that had been a partier, and she decided that she had slept with too many men, done too many drugs, and drank too much alcohol. She needed to clean up her life. So she converted to Islam. She became very religious, but instead of finding the real Islam, she found extremism. And she started a website, and she started egging on men to go on jihad. The guy she was married to also attended an extremist mosque in Belgium, and he was sent off to kill General Massoud right before 9/11. He's the guy that I'm sure you've heard about. He had a camera, and inside his camera was a bomb. So he exploded himself and General Massoud alongside himself. So Malika was for a time in Afghanistan, met Osama bin Laden, and was very proud of that, and would write things on the internet like, if you men are too afraid to go and fight jihad, then we will, and shame on you. Also, we have women that offer themselves as prizes. When we were looking at the Toronto 18, the group that Mubin had the courage to go undercover, and he was talking about the things that we did. Keep in mind that he was the informant. He wasn't a terrorist. He was helping to round up those people. And if you look at the profiles of the women, they were writing on social media things about their husbands like, if my husband's not willing to carry out jihad, meaning militant jihad, then I want to be able to divorce him. Or this is the only way to act, and always endorsing things that were violent extremism. We had a group of women in Holland doing the same thing. They were seduced by a guy over the internet. He invited them to a study group with a woman because he himself couldn't run it. They wouldn't have attended it. And little by little, these women were seduced into, if you really believe in this, sign a last will and testament to be a suicide bomber, and why don't you marry one of our guys? And so secretly, they married other Dutch guys that had committed themselves to jihad. So the guy got the reward of sex, I mean, in the here and now, not waiting for the houris after he explodes himself, but a sexual reward right now with a pretty girl. And they were giving this reward to jihadis and not telling their families that they were involved. These were part of the Hofstede group. Then nowadays we have the brides of ISIS. So we have women like Leith taking off, going to join ISIS, and these women seem to believe, from what we can see of them, they seem to believe the whole line about that ISIS is building a true utopia, that they will be able to live by Islamic ideals, that they'll raise their kids in a good way. They're excited about becoming the wife of a jihadi, and they go off in droves as young kids. We had 4 take off from Scotland. We had Leith talking more and more girls into it. We've had girls from the US. We had one, Shannon Connolly, that was Skyping with a Tunisian ISIS fighter, and they basically had a love affair over Skype. And we all know that when you fall in love, you're highly motivated, and you'll do anything for the person that you're in love with. And the guys catch them this way. And we've had now a journalist in France and a journalist in Canada pretend to be a young woman interested in jihad. And they were putting out tweets and putting out things on Facebook, pretending they were into jihad. One of these was not even a woman, it was a guy. And the ISIS guys found them and said, you need to know about me. And the woman in Paris that was a journalist, she followed it all the way through. The guy said, would you like to marry me? Well, first they Skyped. You know, he wanted to check her out, see if she's good looking, all that kind of thing. And they Skyped, and she pretended that she was very interested in him. And finally he said, okay, you need to go to Amsterdam, because the way you go, if you go from Paris, you might get arrested. But if you go from Amsterdam, nobody will know what's going on. And our woman that we'll send will meet you in Istanbul, and then you carry on. And she was going to go all the way to Istanbul because she was so curious what this was about. But it turned out when she got to Amsterdam, and he told her, buy a new phone, a clean phone, so you can call us, and then we'll give you the instructions. And of course she didn't go, she was a journalist. But we've had many true ones go. And we've also had the reverse. We've had a honey trap with the Syrians. I love this. They pretended to ISIS guys that they were good-looking women that wanted to be brides of ISIS. And, you know, they're tweeting with them and Facebooking. And the guys say, send me a picture. And the Syrians were so smart that they figured out how to send them a picture that downloaded the contents of their phone. So a reverse honey trap. I love it. But as I told you, sometimes Muslim women are homebound, so the internet is very attractive. And nowadays, ISIS is using the internet. They're using social media to catch people, and Mubin gave you a good example of that. And I could go on about that a bit more. They also, women in almost every terrorist group are asked to be the indoctrinators of the next generation. This is baby Hamas that I met in Hebron. And, you know, I just feel sorry for this child. He's brought into something that he doesn't even understand. He's a baby. And it's, you know, better to, you know, get your own choices, right? And we've had this, women are encouraged in Al-Qaeda, in Inspire, from Al-Qaeda in the Arabic Peninsula, and now from ISIS to play this role. Then there's also the roles of couriers of messages. the person that carries the money. We've got one woman from Canada that had her geolocator on her phone on. I guess Canadian phones, you can't turn it off the way they're sold and configured. And either her phone is traveling around all into territory that ISIS controls and doesn't control. So it may be a man carrying it around, but if she herself is carrying it, she's looking like she's doing the work of a spy. And we don't suspect women as much, right? So she can move around more easily, and she also covers her face and her body, so she's not as recognizable. We also have women doing recruitment and carrying out propaganda roles. This is Muriel de Kock. She was a suicide operative, and we know that terrorist groups don't let women into the leadership generally, so they're more dispensable. It's easier, I mean, you might feel real pity to send a woman as a suicide operative, but you don't miss her because she wasn't the leader of the group. You haven't decimated your group if you send a woman. You have to think about the group, you know, your cultural milieu. So in Palestine, when they sent Wafa Idris as a bomber, they were afraid to claim her. Fatah didn't claim her for 3 days. But when they saw the outpouring of praise for what Wafa had done, then they suddenly said, it was us, it was us. And, but here you see Muriel de Kock, and do you know which one she is? She's the top one, but it could be either one. A white European-looking girl, blondie, blue eyes, and you know, she can pass almost anywhere without suspicion. She went to try to bomb a checkpoint in Iraq. She ended up only killing herself, but her idea was to kill American soldiers. As far as female suicide terrorism, there up to 2006, I need to update this, there were 220 female bombers. They were 15% of the total of all bombers, and the highest female participation was in the LTTE, the Tamil Tigers, and some of those girls had been raped, unfortunately, not by their own. That's a common claim by the countries that are fighting it. They'll say their own people raped them. It's very rarely true. But it may be true that the opposite side raped them. And in the LTTE, that was true. Then the second was the Palestinian groups. Third was the Chechen Black Widows. And here you see a chart of that. As far as social support, women generally are glorified for what they do. They get a huge amount of media. Let's look at that for a minute. This is a poster in Wafa Idris's house. I went and talked to her family. You see this giant poster of Wafa. This is a boy and a girl growing up under the shadow of that poster. What are they feeling? You know, what are their choices growing up if this is always idealized? Then we also have to think of the group dynamics. Oftentimes when women are sent, they're sent with a chaperone, or they're sent in pairs, so that they can detonate one after the other, and sometimes so that they give each other courage. And we have different groups. Boko Haram has used women, but we don't know what that's about. Boko Haram is a very hard group to understand what's happening. So these might be women that have been taken captive and forced to do it. Iraqi women, we saw them, we saw the group start to use Iraqi women, just like the Palestinians, late in the game. I'm talking about Al-Qaeda 1.0. They used women late in the game because they can cross checkpoints and they weren't suspected. But they didn't use them right in the beginning. That's what I expect of ISIS. ISIS right now is not sending women. They're following the conservative line of, we need you as wives, we need you as security checkpoint people, but we're not going to send you to drive a truck and explode yourself or go through a checkpoint and explode yourself. But I think if they get hemmed in more and their territory gets smaller, we will start to see that. And here's an example of media amplification at its best. Terrorists all want to play in the media. They want a lot of attention because it earns them money, it earns them more recruits, it makes them look serious, and it creates more terror beyond the simple people that they struck. So we see the Chechens going into Beslan with half of the operatives as women, and they were wearing these black robes. They were actually Salafi robes, which I'm sure you're familiar with, but the media in Russia was not familiar with that, and the Western media wasn't, so they dubbed them Black Widows. They thought they were a signature of widowhood, and some of them were in fact widows. All of them had a family member that had been killed by the Russians, but they weren't necessarily in mourning. They were dedicated Salafis and dressing as Salafis. But they got tons of media because of how they looked. And here we have one of their tapes ahead of time that played, and they were saying things like, if we're killed in the thousands, our brothers and sisters will come after us ready to sacrifice themselves. And if a man said this, it's horrifying, but it's much more horrifying coming from the lips of women, right? And terrorist groups know this. Here we see the women again in the theater, and women as killers totally fascinate us. So if a group decides to use women, they know they're going to get a lot of media. So why do women join terrorist groups? Some join because they're fed up. If they're in a place like West Bank or Gaza or in Chechnya, they want to drive the occupier out. They want freedom. They may be trauma-driven. There's people in their family that were killed. We stayed in the home of one girl that when we were all going to sleep, she stood up in her bed, or sat up in her bed, and said, just give me a gun, I want to kill as many Israelis as possible. And we asked her, why are you saying that? And she said, look around my room, her apartment. And she said, didn't you see all the martyrs posters? Those are all my friends. They were all killed by Israelis. And, you know, she felt hopeless, despair, anger, horror, and she wanted revenge. And she knew that if she went to the group, she could get equipped. Other times, it's to express community outrage. They may know that it's not going to make a political difference, but they want the other side to feel the pain that they feel. Sometimes they're coerced. Sometimes they want a positive sense of identity, just like the guys. They want to feel good about themselves. They want to belong to a group. They want a sense of purpose or significance. They may want excitement. You know, girls want excitement too. It's not just the guys. They may be having a love affair. Like I told you, Shannon Connolly, she was in love with her Tunisian ISIS fighter, and she was hellbound to go and join ISIS. Her dad called the FBI and had them arrest her at the airport. And sometimes they want to escape a dreary or abusive home life. Let's see, I'm going to skip this in the interest of time. Keep in mind that men and women have different ways of making moral judgment. Girls, it turns out, make their moral judgments more based on relationships. So this is a picture from Rafah. And it's a little boy that got caught in the crossfire between a group and the Israelis. And I can guarantee you that most people looking at that don't think about which side is right or wrong. They just think about that little boy, and he shouldn't have been killed. And a girl that's judging that, she's really motivated by relationships and may make really strong moral judgments based on that. That's not saying that a man won't, but that women do it that way. Here's the little girl that I told you about in her destroyed home. And, you know, that's not going to leave a scar on her forever. And we know that socialization plays a huge role. In the conflict zones, the kids are exposed to trauma day in and day out. When I was walking around in Jenin, I was with a couple of Palestinians, and we heard some Israeli jeeps coming. And right away, the Palestinians said, oh, those are Israeli jeeps. And they were far away. And I said, how do you know that? And they said, oh, we know every sound. We know the helicopters, we know the jeeps, we know everything. And just by the sound of it. And people in Kashmir will tell you the same thing. They know the sound of the guns. They know the sound of everything. And if you live in a conflict zone, that's what you're living with. If you live in a non-conflict zone, how you're socialized. If your family's telling you, I interviewed people in Antwerp, I interviewed people in Leeds, that's Belgium and the UK, and they said, our parents are more extreme than us. They think this is great if we join these groups. That's not always the case. What are the advantages of female participation? You can pass security, you can hide weapons, it's hard to search a woman, you get a lot of media amplification, and we have to admit that we're more terrified when a woman carries out a terrible act. What are the disadvantages? Women can't carry big loads like men. They may not meet the physical requirements of combat or of being a militant. Sometimes there's a social backlash in the community if you use women, if the community doesn't believe that women should be involved. And the truth is, women sometimes talk too much. So there can be issues with that. What are the commonalities? The group, there's always a group. There's always an ideology. There's always some level of social support, and there's always individual motivations. I think I've told you these, so I'm going to, and I've told you, yes, Al-Qaeda at first said that women shouldn't be involved, that their main role should be to raise the children. But here we see Muriel DeCoque, and we see other women from Al-Qaeda that have been involved and have carried out operations. Is ISIS involving women? Absolutely. They're called to be wives and mothers. There's some press about a sex jihad. I don't think it's true. I think when the women go and they're Sunni and they're believers, they've drunk the Kool-Aid, they believe in the caliphate there, they legitimately marry. Do they rape other women? Absolutely. The Yazidis are raped, the Christians are raped, but I don't think they're turning these women into prostitutes. I think they're truly becoming wives. They have the role of being a morality police, being medics, being recruiters of other women, being on social media. I think we're going to see them become suicide operators. I don't know if we'll see them become fighters. Depends. And then as far as fighting back, I've told my military over and over again, you've got to be very sensitive about gender. When I was working in Iraq, and we had the door kickers, the guys that went in and kicked down the door and went into the house. If you come into a house and you terrify a woman, her men are going to fight back. Whatever you do to a woman, the men are going to be enraged, right? So you have to be very sensitive about that. And I think that's all I'll say about it. And these are my books, and I'm happy for you to have the slides through Trends, and thank you very much for your attention.